Welcome to my 213th video on my work with OO gauge. This part will feature what I think it's fair to say is a most unusual item, a Graham Farish 3-rail OO gauge train set. Personally, I had no idea that such a thing even existed until I saw this one listed on eBay UK, and I went ahead and bought it for the sheer curiosity value as much as anything else, and because of my strong interest in Hornby Dublo 3-rail. At the end of this part there will be some video of my attempts to run the Formo rolling stock on my Dublo tracks. This is the train set that I bought, well, the cover of its box. Note that it says at the bottom, Formo Products Limited, one of the Graham Farish group of companies. Before seeing this set I'd never heard of Formo Products, and I had no idea that Graham Farish ever made 3-rail OO gauge railway models, although I did know they'd made OO gauge models of various sorts for a while. And before I get into the details of this train set, I just want to review in a more general way Graham Farish OO gauge railway models, what I've personally encountered myself, and what I know about what was produced beyond what I've actually encountered. Pretty certainly the most commonly encountered Graham Farish OO gauge models are items like this. These are Graphar OO gauge coaches. These are essentially quite modern items designed for 2-rail running with tension lock couplings modelled in plastic in considerable detail and quite accurately scaled for OO gauge as 1/76th the size of the prototype. Here you can see one out of its box. The reason that you can't see the couplings when the coaches are boxed is that they're boxed with the bogies reversed, so the couplings are facing inwards. These Graphar coaches are very similar to the Airfix coach models from about the same period, which would basically be the late 1960s and the 1970s. The only other Graham Farish OO gauge items that I had before buying this recent train set were these LMS vent vans. I'm not entirely sure when these date from, but I'd say they were made earlier than the coaches, perhaps in the earlier 1960s or late 1950s. Here's a close-up of the couplings of the wagons. They are rather similar to the early triang couplings. Here you can see the two Graphar wagons on my main Hornby layout between an LMS X-L&YR saddle tank from OO Works and a Hornby LMS brake van. This, I think, illustrates a common feature of earlier Graham Farish OO gauge models. They're seriously overscale. I don't for a moment believe that these properly represent real-world prototypes at 1/76th of the real dimensions. And this tendency to overscale dimensions seems to be fairly typical of a lot of early Farish models supposedly in OO gauge. Certainly it's true of the rolling stock in my new set, as we'll see shortly. Here's a reproduction of a Graham Farish advertisement from 1965. Note that it says that the new OO gauge coaches will be available shortly, so I think that this gives us an indication as to when these models were first produced, and I believe they continued to sell into the 70s. They must have sold quite well, as it isn't hard to find used ones for sale, and that probably couldn't be said about any other Farish OO gauge models. Here are a couple more Graham Farish advertisements for OO gauge items. The one on the right is much earlier, from 1950. The one on the left is from 1962. The older advert refers to Formo flexible track. The later advert uses the name Formo Way. It's much more common to see the Farish track referred to as Formo Way. And after the later plastic coaches, Formo Way 2-rail track is probably the most commonly found Farish OO gauge item. I was very interested to see that the advert on the right offers flexible 3-rail track for sale by the yard with either steel or brass rails. I've never seen 3-rail flexible track, and this advert is about the only evidence I've seen that it ever existed. If you've ever actually handled 3-rail flexible track, I'd love to hear details about it. Here are a couple more adverts for the Formo Way track. These are later, from the mid-1960s, so clearly Formo Way track was sold for quite a while, at least in the two-rail version. Note that these advertisements appear to be for a system somewhat similar to current Pico Streamline track, with flexible sections used for straights and curves, and a complex range of point work and crossovers available. I haven't seen any mention of three-rail Formo or Formo Way track after the 1950 advert previously seen. Here's a picture of some Formo Way two-rail points and crossovers. I'm not sure how long Farish continued the sale of Formo Way 00 gauge track, but I haven't seen any advertisements for it later than the 1960s. Now on to some Graham Farish 00 gauge locomotives. These are certainly interesting items, but alas, examples are very hard to find, and I've never personally handled one, other than the odd duck that came in my three-rail set, which we'll look at in more detail shortly. Farish did produce several 00 gauge loco models which appeared to have been quite nicely made. They seem to have appeared in the 1950s, and apparently they didn't sell very well, so as I say, examples are hard to find. They don't appear to have been produced for all that long, as by the end of the 1950s, ads were already appearing offering the last examples for sale on a clearance basis. Here you can see an example of the Farish 00 gauge Merchant Navy class, which, so far as I can gather, was one of only 3 classes of tender engine that they produced in 00 gauge. Here are examples of the other 2 classes of tender engine produced in 00 gauge by Graham Farish, the GWR King class and the LMS Black 5 class. You might wonder why the tenders have those strange boxes on the front of them. That's because of the odd type of mechanism that Farish used for their 00 gauge tender engines. The motor was mounted in the tender, but it drove the driving wheels of the locomotive via a drive shaft passing from tender to loco. I've never handled an 00 gauge loco model using this system, although Dapol have used a somewhat similar system for some of their N-gauge tender engine models, and I do have examples of those. Dapol didn't put a big box on the front of the tender, but they did mount the motor in the tender and have it drive the loco wheels via a jointed drive shaft made of black plastic going from tender to loco. Here's another example of the Farish 00 gauge Merchant Navy class. I've no idea how many of these sold, but I can't imagine it was very many given their rarity on the used market. Another issue may have been that these models were prone to failure. Mazak rot was apparently an issue, and I'm not sure how reliable the motors and other mechanism components were. Here's an example of a Farish Black 5 model disassembled, showing the very large motor in the tender and the gear arrangement for driving the drive shaft to the loco. And here's a picture of a Farish 00 gauge Black 5 in partially disassembled state running on blocks for testing. Before getting into model railways, Graham Farish made various domestic appliances, and they may have sourced their motors through connections from that trade. Here's a picture, rather low-res I'm afraid, of examples of the 3 Farish 00 gauge tender engines, left to right, Merchant Navy, Black 5 and King class, with a GWR pannier tank in the rear. Farish produced a number of small tank engines in their 00 gauge range, as well as the tender engines. I think this is about all they produced in the way of 00 gauge tank engines. Late GWR pannier tanks and Prairies. Again, I've never handled an example of one of these models myself. They look to be fairly realistic and properly proportioned. Here's an advert for the 9400 class pannier tank. It's interesting to see that the model is specified as being all metal and having new universal couplings. The price is given as 52 shillings and sixpence, i.e. £2, 12 shillings and sixpence. I rather like the fact that the ad boasts that the metal body is stove-enamelled, perhaps a carryover from the Farish company's past in manufacturing appliances. Here's an advertisement specifically for the pannier chassis, offered at £1 19 shillings and 8p. The motor of this example appears to be very similar to the Triang X04 type. Here are a couple more advertisements for Graham Farish 00 gauge models. The ad on the right is dated from 1950 and again offers both 2-rail and 3-rail flexible track. It would appear that the 2-rail tender loco models were already available in 1950. I'm not sure of the date of the left-hand ad. It's probably from about 1950 also, as the prices given for the flexible steel track are the same, although no mention is made of brass track in this ad. Apparently, as well as the Merchant Navy class, the similar Battle of Britain class was also available. On the left here is a 1954 ad which uses the Formo brand name and offers both 2-rail and 3-rail products. The loco depicted at centre right in that ad is the one included in the train set that I bought. In 1954 it was apparently priced at £2 9 shillings and 6p for the loco and an additional 9 shillings and 6p for the tender, just under £3 in all, quite a bit of money for the time when the average weekly wage was less than £10. That ad also offers for sale the King class tender engine, the Merchant Navy class and the Prairie tank. A USA-type Hudson loco is also listed with a 5-pole motor, no less, for the princely sum of £8 16 shillings and 6p. The right-hand advert is from the December 1959 issue of the Model Railway News. It offers the last few of the King class and Merchant Navy class loco models for clearance sale at £2 and £2.10 respectively. Last chance, all stock to be cleared. So we know that Farish's production of 00 gauge loco models was essentially over by the end of the 1950s, although, as noted, they did later make 00 gauge coaches. Now back to the Graham Farish Formo train set that I bought on eBay UK. I'm not entirely sure that this could be said to be a sensible purchase, but I was just very interested to see an alternative type of British 3-rail 00 gauge railway model. The price for this was £69.95, but by the time I'd paid for shipping to Canada, where I live, and import duties, it cost me just over $200 Canadian. At this point I feel I just have to comment on the box illustration. It seems a bit creepy to me, with the figure appearing much more like some kind of goblin or demon than a human child. My set only included the rolling stock, and that in a somewhat dilapidated state. I managed to find some pictures of a more complete set. It appears that 12 curved track sections and 2 straights were included. My set did have all of the rolling stock as seen here, but not as immaculate as this. I see that one of the straight track sections was permanently wired for power connection. Was the controller not included? I certainly didn't get one. But Farish did make controllers, and here's a picture of a Farish controller, quite a substantial item, with a lever for the direction setting on the right and speed control on the left. It would appear that this unit included a transformer and was designed to plug directly into UK mains. I didn't get any Formo track in my set, but here's a picture that I managed to find of the Formo 3-rail set track, which is seen at the bottom, with a piece of Hornby Dublo 3-rail track at the top. The two are extremely similar, with the main difference being that the Formo track has a much wider base. It would be interesting to see what the Formo 3-rail points were like, but I wasn't able to find any representation, or indeed that Formo 3-rail points were ever made. Here's a comparison of the Formo track at left and the Hornby track at right, seen end-on. The two are extremely similar. The Formo 3-rail track apparently always used small end connecting tabs, whereas the Hornby Dublo track initially used small tabs and later switched to wider tabs, as seen here. Here's my set with the lid removed. I didn't get any track, there was just tissue paper in the sections where the track would have been. I also didn't get the printed cover for the central section. I thought at first that I didn't get any paperwork, but then I realised that this sheet of instructions was pasted inside the lid. There's not really a lot of information there, but it is made clear that the Loco was intended to operate on 12 volts DC, and that a transformer controller was available but not included in the set. Here's the Loco model. It's a very heavy item made entirely of metal. Centre rail pickup is via 2 plunger pickups. When the set arrived, the base of the tender was not attached to the body. There was one small screw inside the tender body. When I tried to use this screw to attach the base to the body, it wouldn't bite at all, as the hole was stripped. I attached the tender chassis to the body using 2.5mm screws, which were a little oversized, so I had to force them into the holes in the metal body. The tender had a short flat with a hole in it protruding from the front for coupling to the Loco. At the back it just had a sort of square loop with no coupling hook, and it didn't appear that there'd ever been provision for one. Here's the first of the wagons, a 7-plank open wagon. These were also entirely metal. They used a form of tension lock coupling, somewhat similar to early triang couplings. Here's the second wagon, which is based on a metal open wagon. And here's a vent van with a sheet metal roof, which was a bit loose. And finally there was a brake van of some sort, perhaps based on an ex-Midland type. The wagons were a bit on the crude side, and as mentioned previously, all seemed rather over-scale in proportions to me. When I initially tried to couple the tender to the Loco, I wasn't able to do so. The drawbar from the Loco sagged too low, so its pin wouldn't engage with the hole on the flat from the tender. I removed the screw holding on the drawbar and also the screw at the front of the chassis, which allowed me to take the chassis out of the body. I replaced the screw holding on the drawbar with a new one and also fitted a washer and bent the drawbar up a little. This did allow me to couple the tender to the Loco. I tried the Loco on my test track. It ran okay, although it needed quite a lot of power and was rather noisy. The Formo Loco model is apparently based on the Southern Railway's Q class, not to be confused with the bullied Q1 class, which was a considerably later development. The Southern Q class was essentially a Midland Fowler 4F design adapted to meet Southern requirements. So apart from some differences in the bodywork, this model should be very close to a Midland 4F. Here I have the Formo model and an Airfix Fowler 4F on my test track together. I think it's evident that the Formo Loco is considerably bigger than the Airfix 4F. I believe this is just because the Formo model has been made way over the proper scale size. Here I've photographed the Formo model top and the Airfix 4F at the bottom, on the same place in the track with the camera in exactly the same position. This illustrates very well, I think, how similar the models are, but how much larger the Formo model is. In reality, the Southern Q class would have had exactly the same gross overall dimensions as the Midland 4F. Here are the two models seen side by side from above, again showing similarities and differences and making the larger size of the Formo model clear. Here's the Airfix Loco model up close. And for comparison, the Formo model up close. Some differences would reflect actual differences in the prototypes, but the lack of a gap under the boiler of the Formo model is just a limitation in the modelling. I got the Formo Loco into the servicing cradle on the bench for some servicing. It basically ran okay, but was rather noisy, and I definitely felt it could benefit from some cleaning and lubrication. I ran it in the cradle and cleaned the wheels with contact cleaner. I lubricated things, axles, conrod bearings, drive gears, etc. with oil and grease as appropriate. I gave some thought to changing the markings on the Formo model since I wanted to run it as LMS, not BR. This is a picture of a Farish Black 5 model, and as you can see, the running number has been cast into the side of the cab as raised digits rather than painted on or applied with decals. My Formo Loco didn't even have a running number on the side of the cab, it just had Formo with a rectangle round it cast into the cab side as seen here. I couldn't really apply decals for a running number over that. So if I wanted to apply a running number, I would basically have needed to grind off the raised Formo markings and then to repaint the side of the cab before applying decals. I didn't really want to do that, so I just left the Formo markings on the cab sides. But I did want to remove the Cycling Lion BR markings from the tender. I went with my now standard procedure of rubbing with methyl hydrate on cotton buds to remove the markings. The colour came off quite readily, but the underlying white marking was obstinate and I had to use some fine emery paper to complete the removal. I washed with water afterwards. The removal wasn't entirely successful and I did consider completely repainting the tender, but I decided it wasn't too bad and it would be better to leave it. I got out some HMRS press-fix decals to provide LMS lettering for the tender. I went with red-shaded gold letters in this case. I cut round a set of letters, curving my cut around the LMS roundels which were printed between the letters. Then I applied the lettering to the side of the tender and wetted the backing tissue with water and removed it. The tender came with no coal load, so I wanted to add one. I put a piece of tack over the coal door so that my load wouldn't fall out as I added it. Then I put some lump coal into the tender. In hindsight, perhaps I should have put more in. I wetted the coal with IPA and then soaked it with watered-down white glue. I used a pipette for applying both the IPA and the glue. I sometimes spray on the IPA, but with something light like this coal, the spray tends to blow the load around. Here's the tender after this application. I find it works best to really soak the coal with glue. The glue will soak in and dry clear. And here is the tender after the glue dried and I removed the tack over the coal door. There was quite a bit of paint missing from the tender, so I touched it up in parts with some flat black. And here's the tender at the conclusion of my efforts. And here are the Loco and tender on the bench. The Formo marking on the Loco cab is rather obvious in a flash picture like this, but I don't think it'll be too noticeable on the layout. Finally, I got the Formo Loco onto my Hornby Dublo 3-rail tracks for some running. Results were rather mixed, as you'll see, but the model did basically sit on the rails properly and pick up electricity okay.
So, let me see what I can do in the way of persuading this Graham Farish Formo 3-rail locomotive to run on my Hornby Dublo 3-rail tracks. I have limited optimism because, yeah, see, he doesn't, nothing. Now he's just stopped again completely. Nope. Well, it's certainly very iffy about running on the Dublo track. For one thing, it really struggles to get over the Dublo points, or most of them anyway. It just doesn't seem to be able to maintain contact. Well, of course, it wasn't designed for Dublo track. It runs okay when there's no point, but I'm not sure whether it's the centre rail contact or the side rail contact. I see now it's just stopped again. Whether I'll be able to get it going again at all is questionable. I might be able to, I might not. Nope. Nope, I don't know what its problem is now, you see. Well, its tender's derailed for one thing, but I don't know whether that really matters. Oh, I don't know. No, see, I can't deal with it, really. I fear what it's doing is overloading the controller. I think it's just drawing more, I'm not turning it up to full voltage, but I think it's just drawing more amperage than the controller really likes. So I think the controller's just overloading after a bit, so I'm not going to push it a bit much. So, unfortunately, it sort of goes, but not very well. But that's not surprising. We won't push it. Given that, I don't think we'll even try and pull its own train with it. We'll try the wagons from the Formo set, but I'll try them with a with a Dublo engine, if I can hook them up to a Dublo engine. Because given that this guy, I think, is overloading the controller, even running light engine, I don't particularly want to try him pulling a train. Well, there are also numerous problems with these Formo wagons. For one thing, their couplings are way higher than normal Hornby couplings. See, I'm trying to couple that to a converter wagon because they're tension lock couplings, but whether it'll stay coupled is a bit iffy. And they're not even the same height as each other. Where are we? See, those two are at a different height. So they're weird tension lock couplings that aren't even at the same height as each other. I've oiled the axles, so they'll roll a bit. I've got them behind the end too. We'll give them a try, but they're obviously not meant for running on Dublo track, so try and run them fairly slowly because I'm sort of expecting them to try and derail. Oh yes. See, the back two have fallen over. I don't know, and the roof's coming off that one as well. Whoops-a-daisy. They're heavy. They're overscale and heavy. He's still on the track. Whoops. Well, see, that doesn't help, because the couplings of those two are just not at the same height, so trying to persuade them to couple to each other is questionable, and they're both Formo ones. So, I mean, they can be very vaguely dragged along Dublo track, but, it's hard to couple them up. I didn't buy it for the couplings, for the wagons, really. Trying to take them as slowly as I can. Yeah, if I take them really at a slow freight speed, I can just about get them round. We got them round once there, but maybe take the engine up a bit more just so you can see the Formo wagons a bit more. That's the N2, which is not very historical for LMS, but it's a nice, reliable little tank engine. So there you go. There's those 4 Formo wagons. The one at the front's not the Formo wagon. That's a converter wagon that I put in so I could couple them up to the N2. But there you go. So I can sort of, at a very slow freight speed, if I'm very careful, persuade them to run on my Hornby layout, but they're a bit overscale and they don't stay on very well. So I thought I'd have one more go with a Formo engine with a different controller, because I thought some of the problems I was having with it might be to do with the controller I was using. The controller I was using was that one. Oh, pardon the clock's chiming again. That's an old Gauge Master controller, a black one that doesn't have a model number on it. And what I've switched to now is this one, which is a Gauge Master Model W controller. I thought it would... Oh, I'm sorry about this with the clocks. I thought they'd finished chiming. I thought it would be a fairly simple changeover since it's plugged in. Where are we? It's plugged into a socket there with a DIN plug. And I thought I'd be able to just unplug one and plug the other in. But it turned out that was not the case, because the DIN plug on the new one was a different type of DIN plug. It was a 4-pin DIN plug, whereas the old one had a 6-pin disc plug on. Although actually the documentation, the sheet that came with the new one, said it had a 6-pin DIN plug on, but it didn't. It had a 4-pin on. So I had to muck around with extensive desoldering. I had to swap the wire from the old one over to the new one, basically. to get it to work. But anyway, I've now got the Formo. I have the Formo engine connected up with its own wagons that came in its train set. It's got a very odd coupling with no hook on the back of its tender, and it doesn't look as if it ever did have a hook. But anyway, we'll see if we can persuade it to run with this new controller. Famous last words. Oh dear, oh dear. We pushed it just a little way and then it decided to stop. Oh, for goodness sake. I really don't know what the problem is with this Formo engine. It seems like in some circumstances it may be shorting out. Maybe its center rail contacts are too big and they're shorting out between the center rail and the outer rail on the points or something. I can't quite tell, but it's certainly extremely erratically running. Sometimes I can just about persuade it to run, but it doesn't like going over the points for sure. That is, it's pulling its own train now, and it doesn't seem to mind. In fact, its own train seems a bit more stable when it's being pulled by it than it was when it was being pulled by the Dublo engine. Oh, famous last words. But I say that. Well, it was having that problem with the Dublo engine that the wagons tend to derail going round the corners. Well, there's no two ways about it. These Formo wagons are pretty awful. They're unstable, and the couplings on them are terrible, and so it's hard to get the engine to go over the points. And if you can persuade the engine to go over the points, whatever, then the stupid wagons derail. This Formo set's a bit of a waste of space. The wagons won't even couple to each other. The engine won't run consistently. It's next to impossible to achieve anything with it. I mean, you keep trying, but the engine gets stuck on the points. The wagons don't couple properly to each other. They derail. We lost a wagon now somewhere. That's a daisy. Oh, there it is. We've come round and hit it again. So that's about all I can do with the thing. It doesn't work, basically, let's face it. I mean, it might work very briefly a bit. One more try. It's a compromise because you sort of have to keep the engine moving to... No, the engine's just decided it doesn't want to move anymore, and the back wagon has derailed again. It's hopeless, isn't it? I keep hoping I'll be able to persuade the thing to go round, but it's blimmin' hard work. We got it going round this end, famous last words, moderately successfully, but then it really struggles here. Yes, this is usually where it dies, yes. One way or another it seems to die here. Oh, blimey, see, these wagons are really having trouble staying on over there. And in any case, oh, for goodness sake. Oh, I give in. Stupid thing. So those Formo wagons are pretty much garbage. They're pretty much completely useless. Let's see if we can have any more success trying to get the Formo engine to go around with Dublo wagons. I mean, the Formo engine itself has great trouble getting over the points, so that's something of a problem at the best of times, but maybe, I mean, I can afford to push the power up a bit more with the Dublo wagons and maybe get him over the points. There we go. Well, I got him, what can I say? I got him to go round twice with that train of Dublo wagons, 3 tank wagons, a brake van, an open converter wagon, and that's the Formo engine, and I think at this point I give up.